somewhere in this. That's great. Well, that's good.
Do you like music?
Yeah, it's good. It's just, I mean, this semester is very different from last semester. There's classes, and now it's like finally starting to get more.
Is it 2 years?
2 years, yeah.
And this is your second? First year, so it's just like 5 months.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you got your legs.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you write in pieces? Is that next year?
No, so our program it's like an hour-long oral examination. So the second years right now are like having a moment because the oral exams are in mid-March, so we're sort of stressed out and studying.
Yeah, I was going to be here as well as like.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, undergrad I did thesis, so I was kind of happy to like take a step back and do something.
The weird thing about oral exam is just that at the time when I took it, I hadn't done it. It was just not the kind of test that was
Right.
career. And one of the things they told me at the time was, oh, this is too sort of complicated. And it actually wasn't at all. Having subsequently taught a lot, like, it wasn't the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
No panel experts, right? You know, it wasn't, but, so it's this sort of weird. Everybody's just keep doing that, you know, or writing.
Right, exactly. Or dancing, whatever. Yeah, so I know that, I mean, from what I've been told, the way that most people select, it's like there's different parts to select to something and then really focus on the solution to that, and then you can find a broader concentration and then international so they'll have a panel as well. I don't have a restricted too much.
Yeah,
just to like spare myself.
Spare yourself. Yeah, there's no point. The semester before.
Yeah,
we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So what kind of classes?
Right now, doing analysis class, enjoying a lot, yeah. Oh, and then there's like a because I definitely want to do something with that. But I think all just less familiar with some kind of yeah, because like in undergrad I was more like security focused, so I'm kind of just like so we'll see. It's funny because I keep like idea of what I wanted to do and just different opportunities. Oh my god, there's so much more. Yeah,
I mean, of course, by the end of it, you get not satisfied. You know, by late next year, you want to have
right.
you know, you develop a moment there, or but
Yeah. Right.
that's what we're. I mean, you're talking to the wrong person for years.
Well, as it should.
Well, but even though you.
So it's how to get glass of water with this one?
Yes,
So that's
absolutely,
lovely.
whatever you want.
And it's also.
Right. Yeah.
That's how much it sounds.
I don't know what order or what.
You're the keynote speaker, so whatever you want. Yeah.
It's fine.
And we'll be live streaming the event, so we'll ask you to talk on the microphone because of the audio.
No problem.
Would you like some coffee?
I'm getting us a glass. Water's fine. Yes, I'm British. You know, tea's the thing, and you know, people in US.
Would you like some tea?
Do you have any?
Yeah, we do have. Let me see which kind of tea we have on there.
Okay. No worries if not.
We'll try. Yeah. I will try that.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. But yeah, like a bit of a repeat, but
It's okay. Actually, Danny, this is Melanie. Danny. Danny's part of our operations side and actually helped with our Venezuela startup for the Colombia response. And Melanie is with FPG's International as a consultant. We wrote this amazing report. wash and the teeth. Yeah.
You'll be able to because I was able to update. Will you be able to update with latest moments?
Potentially, yeah.
How you doing?
Because I know people want to, but I'm very that. I'm very conscious of the fact that like you guys just keep having it. I'm trying to
Just want to make sure I get Trinidad in.
Sure. I was gonna just, sure. Yeah, why don't you? Yeah.
So we have cookies, teas, I don't know if you want other ones. Do you want some honey?
No, I'm fine, thanks. Decaffeinated.
Do you want black tea?
No, it's, yeah, thanks.
good?
But no caffeine, I mean, really.
Okay.
This is not a tea country, is it?
No, unfortunately.
No caffeine, no milk.
Good. Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for braving the snowstorm to be here today. I don't know what happened to it, but Matt Clausen, president of WOLA, want to really appreciate your being here. It's an honor for us to co-host what is really an important launch point for Refugees International report. Venezuela is obviously in the news. It's always been in the news, but it's in the news not once a day, but 20 times a day right now, but typically around the political and economic crisis, whereas the refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, is ongoing no matter what happens with the political crisis. And this report, and there are many other important pieces of work out that are convenings this week around Venezuela, also related to migration. So it's an honor for us to have Refugees International here today, and I know that Eileen Shields West, the chair of the Refugees International Board, is here, Andrew Seeley from NPI is here, so the whole community that's focused on these issues. It's great to have you here. I will be brief and introduce Eric Schwartz as president of Refugees International. In addition to braving the storm today, Eric's braving not feeling well, but has come here for the opening, so we will excuse him for departing early for sure. But Eric's been president of Refugees International since June of 2017, and has a three-decade career focused on humanitarian and human rights issues. And between 2009 and 11, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And as Assistant Secretary, he was credited with strengthening the State Department's humanitarian advocacy around the world, initiating and implementing critical enhancements to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and raising the profile of global migration issues in U.S. foreign policy. Eric, it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity. it's when our folks just said, well, we have the opportunity to co-host an event with WOLA, I said, you know, there's no more highly respected Washington institution, and if it has people like Joe Eldridge around, then by all means we should be there. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank WOLA for the role that it has played, you know, continually over so many decades in terms of you know, promoting understanding of the Western Hemisphere, but also enlightened and progressive policies towards that region of the world. So thank you so much for this. You know, events in Venezuela over the past couple of weeks have filled the headlines, but for a lot of people here, I think this has long been, the situation of Venezuelans has long been a matter of urgent concern. The number of asylum seekers in the region of one form or another stands at more than 3 million, and it makes it one of the largest displacement crises in the world. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Yes. Oh, good. So while politics in Venezuela may be in flux, the end of the displacement crisis is not in sight. Most of the Venezuelans with whom our team spoke in Colombia and in Trinidad thought it would take decades to rebuild the country. None expected to return soon. And that sobering reality only underscores the importance of getting the humanitarian response right. It must be robust at the national level in each of the host countries, but it also has to be coordinated and harmonized across the region. To this end, in October, we identified this issue as a very high priority for our organization. And we launched an initial 6-month effort to assess the situation of Venezuelans in various countries in the region. The first mission, which, excuse me, the first missions about which you will hear, traveled to Colombia and Trinidad. And we actually saw a very dramatic difference in the way each situation is being addressed. In Colombia, the government has generally taken a generous approach. There is to the influx of over 1 million Venezuelans. Gaps remain, but Colombia's ability to respond is constrained not only by limited resources, but the reality of another displacement crisis, and internally a situation of internal displacement involving millions from the Colombian Civil War. The displaced from both countries often reside in the same communities and compete for the same resources. And the crises are colliding, which is why we gave that title to our Colombia report, or our Venezuelans in Colombia report. Colombia needs donor support to sustain and indeed expand assistance, to provide protection and aid to all of the displaced within its borders. In Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuelans are in a status of, well, they're really not in a status. They're undocumented migrants. They lack any means, effective means of regularizing that status. As such, they live under constant threat of detention, deportation. And the government there has done very little to support them and has even violated obligations under international law. Xenophobia is widespread, and women and girls who are at great risk of gender-based violence, trafficking, are particularly vulnerable. These dismal conditions in Trinidad last week drove Venezuelans into the streets in protest. So our fieldwork highlights the disparities in the responses, discrepancy in the rights and services available, sudden changes in national policy, and inadequate access to information. All these issues exacerbate the vulnerability of Venezuelans. A new UNHCR, IOM platform led by Eduardo Stein is working to improve conditions So is the Quito process, which brings together Venezuela's neighbors at the diplomatic level, but much more work needs to be done. The bottom line is that the Venezuela refugee and migrant crisis will be with us for years to come. And the collective humanitarian response must, of course, be tailored to the specific conditions of host countries, but some lessons have already been clear. First, legal status matters. Host countries must create channels for Venezuelans to regularize status and access rights and services, not just in name, but in practice. There's no alternative. Second, regional coordination is critical. Quito and the UNHCR IOM platform are steps in the right direction, but sustained leadership is essential. Third, an effective response must address immediate humanitarian needs, but also longer-term solutions. It will take years to repair the damage of the last decade. In the interim, millions of Venezuelans need the support of the international community. Fourth, and to that end, donors must continue to step up. In addition to money, they should provide technical assistance to countries where Venezuelans have sought refuge. They can also help those countries to develop stronger asylum and protection systems. So let me end by where I began, thanking WOLA for hosting this important I'm really not going to die, don't worry. For hosting this important discussion at such a critical time, and the opportunity to share our insights and think together about the way forward. We think this is a global refugee reporting and advocacy organization. I cannot ignore a crisis of the magnitude that we are seeing in countries surrounding Venezuela. We had no choice but to get engaged and to be engaged. But we do so with a keen appreciation that there are others in this town and around the world who have been deeply engaged in these issues over time, and we benefit enormously by the contact and collaboration with organizations like the Washington Office on Latin America. So I will bid you adieu, and thank you very much for your time. Stay in the back for a while.
So, musical chairs. I'm John Walsh. I'm the Director for Drug Policy in the Andes at WOLA, and I want to thank Eric and Refugees International for their kind words about WOLA, and we're thrilled to have them here to discuss these reports today. I think Eric already did a wonderful job in setting the stage, so I think we'll turn right now to our experts. Melanie Teff, expert on displacement crises, consultant for Refugees International, and as Eric mentioned, she traveled to Colombia in October and Trinidad and Tobago in November as part of an RI field mission to research the response to the Venezuelan refugee and migrant crisis. She will be followed by WOLA's own Assistant Director for Venezuela, Jeff Ramsey, a close observer of the situation in Venezuela, an expert on U.S. policy towards the country, and he works in close cooperation with counterparts in Venezuela and around the region to advance nonviolent democratic solutions to Venezuela's crisis. Both will speak for about 15 minutes, and I'll time them so that we make sure we have enough time for questions and discussion. So without further ado, Melanie.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the key findings from the trip that we made to Colombia and Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that we've talked about the huge numbers, first of all. I mean, Colombia, more than 1 million, more than 3 million in the region, and the projections are much higher, although, of course, much depends on what happens over the next few weeks, of course. the first thing that all agencies were saying to us was the change in demographics of the people arriving. Like 18 months ago or so, you had people with much more resources, a much higher educated population, many of them coming in planes. Then you move to people coming on buses, and now we're at a stage of some people actually walking across the continent. People arriving with much less resources and in need of humanitarian aid in a way that people weren't 18 months ago, those who were arriving. Also, having been to speaking to people in many other refugee and migrant crises, I've never seen a situation where so many people talked about their medical needs as one of their principal reasons for leaving. And basically, I would have died or my child would have died if we hadn't left, because we had medical care that we don't have now. That's an unusual element of this crisis, I think. In terms of the call for a regional response, I think we saw really a graphic illustration of the problem, having been by chance at the Colombian-Ecuadorian border on October 27th last year, which was 4 days before Peru. Peru had announced that if you didn't get to Peru by midnight on October 31st, you would no longer be eligible for the special Venezuelan one-year residence and work permit. So there was this rush to the border, rush to try and get to Peru by that time. And so when we were at the border, we saw at Rumichaca, we saw at least 5,000 people in the line, which is more than double the usual. People were staying overnight and getting hypothermia because they weren't going to lose their spot in the line. And that's just on the Colombian side. There were, of course, more thousands on the Ecuadorian side as well. And talking to Colombian government officials, they were saying, you see, a state further down in the continent, 2 countries away from us, changes their policy suddenly, and we have a humanitarian crisis here at our border. And it's just an example of what happens when there isn't coordination between countries. And so a real need, the same thing happened in August last year when Ecuador demanded valid passports. And so a real need for harmonized entry requirements, for regional agreements on principles and standards for ideally for regional for residence and work permits. And one thing that kept coming up was the issue of facilitating family reunification. What was happening is that if one country changes its rules partway through and a child has got partway across the continent to reach their family, and then they can't get the last part because they don't have the document that is now being required from a country. And the requirement for a flexibility in the type of documents that can realistically be obtained by people. As we know, it's very hard to get a passport nowadays in Venezuela. And so a recognition of that reality by officials is essential. And we've seen some steps forward with the Quito process that Eric mentioned, and with the group of Lima a couple of weeks ago agreeing on how passports expired for up to 5 years should be accepted. So we see these steps forward, but then we see steps backward again, because like last week, Ecuador announces that we're going to require certified criminal antecedents documents. We can imagine how hard that's going to be for people to obtain. And of course, that was in reaction to a horrible incident in Ecuador about 10 days ago, when a Venezuelan man killed an Ecuadorian woman. And one understands a reaction, but the result of this is going to be that more and more people are going to end up taking informal routes and ending up without documents in the region. And that's something that all the states are saying that they're trying to avoid. With regard to the question of legal status, I mean, it's clear that this influx in Latin America is basically being treated as a migrant crisis rather than a refugee crisis, and that's despite the fact that most host states have actually signed up to the Cartagena Declaration, which adopts a wider definition of refugees, including those from a country where there's widespread state collapse and widespread generalized violence. And it's interesting talking to Venezuelans around the region. If you ask people, most people I spoke to, when you ask why did you leave, the first thing they would say is lack of food, lack of medicines. But you kind of scratch the surface, and very often it's lack of food because my family was taken off the list for the clap because they were in a dispute with this person in the party, or well, my child was kidnapped and there seemed to be collusion with the authorities. There was often a story behind the initial just lack of food and medicines. So it's a little more complicated than what appears on the surface. Ideally, we would see the prima facie application of the Cartagena Declaration, and that would assist with integration longer term, because the problem with all the arrangements that we're seeing, and some very impressive migration arrangements we're seeing, is that they're short term. And there's going to be a problem at the end of these residence and work permits in each case. And with regard to Colombia, the Colombia government has made impressive efforts to register and regularize Venezuelans. It has gaps, but one has to recognize first of all, the border permits, the temporary border permits, 1.6 million issued up to February last year, and a reopening of that scheme this year, a transit permit for up to 10 days. And in 2017, they started the so-called PEP, the up to 2 years residence and work permit, initially for people with documents. But then last year, between April and June last year, they asked people to register even if you had no documents, Venezuelans to register with no documents, and 442,000 people registered, and they then offered them residence and work permits if they went through the next stage of the bureaucracy. Not everybody was able to follow it, the complicated system. I have to say that interviewing a lot of people, there were so many different accounts of what you needed to do, and a lot of people unfortunately did miss the time scale for when they needed to register. But there have been important attempts to make this system work. There were particular groups we saw left out, and one group I would highlight would be indigenous groups, the Wayu and the Yukpa, for example, binational groups, theoretically included, but in practice, extra steps really need to be taken for groups like these who have much more difficulty complying with such regulations. As Eric noted, given the huge pressure on Colombian government resources that this represents, there's a real need for assistance and longer-term assistance. 57% of Venezuelans are now in cities scattered throughout Colombia rather than at the border. And so they're requiring a type of assistance that isn't that emergency food handouts, but is an injection of support into Colombian government systems, social support systems. I think one of the things that struck me most in Colombia was that I'd gone to look at the Venezuelan situation, but it was impossible to ignore the situation in Colombia itself, the internal conflict in Colombia itself, and the fragility of that situation. Yes, of course, the peace deal took place in 2016 with the FARC, but since then, unfortunately, the humanitarian indicators have not been looking positive in Colombia. There have been a lot of problems with other armed groups, such as the ELN, such as paramilitary groups, often taking over former FARC territory. And OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs of the UN, reports that in 2018, there were 113% more mass displacements in Colombia over 2017, and 32% more attacks by armed groups on civilian population in 2018 than in 2017. So unfortunately, the trends with regard to that situation are not looking good. And it's into that situation that Venezuelans are coming. Often the unofficial routes, that the so-called troches, the informal entrances into the country that the Venezuelans, are using when they don't have the documents that you need, many of them are run by armed groups, with all the risks that involves for crossing them, for robbery, for rape, for recruitment into armed groups as well. And that's one of the things we heard about a lot in Colombia, was that if you don't have a document, well, the armed groups aren't requiring documents. And so there's this real risk of Venezuelans being recruited to cultivate coca, to be exploited in the sex trade, to act as lookouts and traffickers for drugs. And I'm sure that we'll hear perhaps a little more on the drug situation from others who know more than I. But it was reported to me that this was a real concern in that it was swelling the ranks of, swelling the resources of the armed groups. And at the same time, it was creating a huge risk for Venezuelans who are coming into a situation it's completely unfamiliar to them. Colombians have often learnt how to navigate a little the situation. This is totally new to Venezuelans, and we were hearing of casualties of Venezuelans being injured or killed in these situations between armed groups. And then we talked to humanitarian agencies and asked, well, where is your attention going to the Colombians, to the Venezuelans? And we were told 70–80% of our attention now is going to the Venezuelan situation. That's where the resources are, that's where the attention is. And so it seemed really important to be flagging up at this time the need to not ignore the elephant in the room. And because it's going to, in the end, result in a problem not only for Colombians but also for Venezuelans. And it shouldn't be that these issues are having to compete. And we were being told, for example, with regard to medical care, well, medical care was one of the commitments to former combatants. And if it's going to be a competition between whether Venezuelans who are arriving get that assistance or if ex-combatants get that assistance, that's really problematic. So I think I'll stop there on the Colombia issues, and very happy, of course, to discuss further and take questions. But I'm going to turn to Trinidad and Tobago, which is a very different setting. I mean, the Caribbean in general has responded to Venezuelans very differently to Latin America in general. And in Trinidad and Tobago, well, first of all, the numbers. The official number is 40,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago. That's been the official number since 2015. So it's likely it's more than that, but there aren't any official figures. Of course, that's a lot lower than a lot of the Latin American countries we're talking about. But on the other hand, it's an extremely high percentage of the population. It's the whole population of Trinidad and Tobago is just over 1 million, and in Port of Spain, it's a very high proportion. There's no refugee law in Trinidad and Tobago. And so it's resulting in a situation where even if you get refugee status, because UNHCR is doing refugee status determination, even if you get refugee status, you're not getting the right to work legally. Children are not getting the right to go to school. So that's a very different situation to what we're seeing in Latin America generally. And there was a 2014 refugee policy in Trinidad and Tobago, we're told, that was approved by the cabinet, which has a lot of positive things in it, but that's not being implemented. And there's no migration routes. Unlike if in Colombia, the asylum system isn't working very well at the moment, but there's a migration route for residence and work permits for many people to access. That's not the case in Trinidad and Tobago. Venezuelans generally are unable to access any of the possibilities through the Immigration Act. And so what I saw in Trinidad and Tobago was just not only detention and deportation as an issue, but the fear of it affecting the whole population. So there were about 440 people, we were told, were in immigration detention in November in Trinidad and Tobago, either in the immigration detention center itself or in the maximum security prison or the women's prison for just immigration-related offenses, just for, in inverted commas, illegal entry, illegal stay, or illegal working. So basically, that's why we called our report Forced into Illegality, because unless you've got private independent means, you, as a Venezuelan in Trinidad and Tobago, you're breaking the law, because if you're working, the likelihood is you're breaking the rules. That leads to people living in hiding. Everyone was terribly scared that they were going to be taken off to the immigration detention center where they could be weeks, months, years, because they are also requiring security bonds, so you have to pay if you're going to be give a bond to leave the immigration detention center under a supervision order, you have to pay the amount it would cost to deport you. And just to note that that's bad enough for Venezuelans, but if you're Syrian or if you're from an African country, the figures are enormous. And as people said to me, how are we supposed to raise this money when we're not allowed to work and we're being held in detention? There's one NGO working with Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, And really, it's quite a difficult environment for NGOs to be able to work, but we think it's very important for NGOs to consider the possibilities. There are areas where it might be possible to negotiate some more access with the government, for example, on livelihoods issues. And just lastly to note that that Trinidad and Tobago, it was often said, well, this is a relatively rich country. It's hard to raise funds for a country like this. And staff of UN agencies were saying, given how extreme the situation is here for refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, just a call for an understanding of the high staff costs involved in registration, in refugee status determination, and in gender-based violence counselling and trafficking counselling. And probably of all the countries in the Latin America and the Caribbean that are receiving Venezuelans, the highest reports of trafficking of women and girls is in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And the risk of my role here is I was so enthralled that I forgot my timekeeping, but then you ended up under time anyway. And you really, really underscored the exquisite vulnerability of these people as they're fleeing. And so we turn to Jeff, and then we'll go to open the discussion.
Yeah, I really just want to echo that point. So I'm Jeff Ramsey. I'm the Assistant Director for Venezuela at WOLA. My work focuses on advancing nonviolent democratic solutions to the political crisis in Venezuela, as well as supporting multilateral responses to the humanitarian crisis around the region. And I think it's really, really important that as we applaud the international community for denouncing the abuses of the Maduro regime, and for speaking out against about the conditions in Venezuela, that we ensure that our support for Venezuelans doesn't end when they leave Venezuela. I really think that there is a risk of all of the incredible hardships that Venezuelans are facing as they flee their country. There's this risk that that could take some kind of second tier to the urgent political crisis in Venezuela, and I think we should avoid that. So I really just want to echo some of the points that Melanie just made. And first, I wanted to, before I get into that, I kind of wanted to talk about the U.S. role in all of this and some of the events that we've seen in recent days. On Monday, as some of you may have heard, the United States government announced new sanctions that effectively prevent the U.S. from purchasing oil or from exporting refined products like gasoline to Venezuela, which Venezuela uses to refine its heavy crude. These oil sanctions will very clearly have an impact on Venezuela. The oil revenue accounts for almost all of the hard currency that's used to purchase imports of already scarce food and medicine in the country. I think the assumption is that these oil sanctions will cause some kind of split in the military or some kind of regime collapse, and that's very far from clear. But what we can absolutely be certain of is that the longer this measure remains in place, it will deepen human suffering in Venezuela and could accelerate the number of Venezuelans who are fleeing the country. I also think it's important that we recognize that the U.S. government has an opportunity, as it encourages other countries in the region to adopt a humane regional response to Venezuelans who are fleeing, that the U.S. recognizes that it has an opportunity to join in this humane response here at home. Instead, what we've seen is this administration has placed the lowest ceiling on refugee admissions since 1980. There is bipartisan support for extending TPS, temporary protected status, to Venezuelans, and we even saw some movement in Congress to that effect in mid-2017. But in the last year, the government has announced that it would terminate TPS for people from Honduras, El Salvador, and Haiti. Inexplicably, while there would be broad support for extending TPS to Venezuelans, this looks unlikely under the current political climate. I think also that the U.S. needs to be, it's very clear that the U.S. government needs to be willing to offer more resources in support of the regional response to Venezuelans who are fleeing their country, as Melanie mentioned. I was just going through some of the statistics from financial year 2018 about this. The U.S. government spent 4 times as much on the regional displacement crisis in Burma as on Venezuela. That's $396 million versus $93 million. Even as the number of displaced Venezuelans is 3 times higher than the number of Rohingya refugees. Obviously, they're very different crises, and we really can't compare them in a complete parallel. But I do think that this really highlights the need for more U.S. resources. In just 3 years, the number of Venezuelans living abroad has risen from some 500,000 to over 3 million. If this current pace continues, we can expect the number of Venezuelans abroad to surpass the number of Syrians abroad by 2023. Meanwhile, the UN has issued a request for $738 million to respond to the Venezuela situation in 2019. That's an increase from, I believe, the supplementary appeal by the UNHCR was $46 million the year before. That's a huge increase. Again, obviously, Venezuela's crisis is different from other regional displacement crises, and we really can't compare apples and oranges. Venezuelans have very different needs in receiving countries, but it is clear that the U.S. should stand prepared to offer more funds. By the same token, it's absolutely certain that money alone is insufficient, as Melanie and Daphne have laid out in the reports on this. So far, the region has talked a big game on coordination in adopting some kind of minimal standards in response to fleeing Venezuelans. But they've actually shown much less willingness to take steps towards widening access to regular status so that Venezuelans can live, work, and access health care. The statements that we've seen out of the Quito process, I agree, have been very, very important. But they've given themselves broad leeway. There's commitment to things like accepting expired travel documents as valid, subject to legislation, or guaranteeing access to health and education in accordance with available resources. So I really think that the international community should focus on making much more concrete commitments to mid and long-term solutions to the needs of Venezuelans. The issue of expired travel documents is fundamental. When I was last in Venezuela in August, the going rate for obtaining a passport was over $1,000, which is prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of Venezuelans. I think it's important to highlight the positive elements of Colombia's response to Venezuela's crisis in this. Colombia's example of extending access to the Permiso Especial de Permanencia is very important. But it has limitations, as Melanie mentioned. Colombia's own government recognizes that there are around 1 million Venezuelans in the country, but less than half of these were able to take advantage of the registration process. So what is the long-term plan in Colombia for the other half? There doesn't seem to be a clear path forward for these Venezuelans. I also, I do think that there is a risk that as we focus on the political crisis, that some of this sort of takes precedence over the regional response to Venezuelan migrants and refugees. An element or a trend that we've seen recently in Washington that we find particularly concerning is a pattern of uncritical applause for anything that any regional government does in reaction to Venezuela's crisis, as long as it's framed in the language of humanitarian support. So a good example is, I believe in February or March of last year, Chile announced what they called a democratic responsibility visa. That has a really great name, and one would think that this is a genuine measure that is aimed at supporting the needs of fleeing Venezuelans. But the truth is that this visa actually made it much more difficult for Venezuelans to migrate legally to Chile. And so I really think that, again, as we respond to the crisis internally in Venezuela and the push factors that are fueling this regional displacement crisis, countries really shouldn't forget their obligations at home. Similarly, I think the U.S. needs to take care to avoid fueling any push factors that aggravate the crisis. The current situation in Venezuela is increasingly looking like a stalemate. I think what we've seen over the last week was that there was this hope that the international community, in recognizing a transitional government, would shake something loose and signal support for some kind of split within Maduro's ruling coalition that could lead to a transition. I think that's also the idea behind the imposition of these new broader economic sanctions. And we haven't seen any evidence of this. And I think that the longer that this situation draws on, the clearer it becomes the best path forward is some kind of negotiated process that allows for free, fair elections so Venezuelans themselves can decide who their leaders are. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And before we go to questions, I just want to mention that I neglected to say another bit of musical chairs. I was not meant to be the moderator. Jeff was going to be, because our colleague Jimena Sanchez, director for the Andes, was intending to be here. She's unable to be here today and really regrets that. So the musical chairs is that Jeff was presenting and I was moderating instead. So I'm clearly not Jimena. She would have brought an enormous range of experience, especially on the Colombia side. So she regrets not being here today. I think Jeff ended on a good note to launch into questions and discussion, because whatever does happen within Venezuela, and the pace of events has been accelerating in the past couple of weeks, there's enormous uncertainty over how the political crisis may or may not be resolved. But in any case, the numbers of Venezuelans fleeing are already astoundingly large, and there doesn't look to be any quick fix to the humanitarian crisis within Venezuela that is prompting this. So in any case, we do need to focus on how countries who are on the receiving end of that can better address the needs of fleeing Venezuelans. So with that, I want to turn to your questions to get the discussion going. We have a good 20 minutes. What I would ask is that, especially so that everyone can hear, if you could stand, tell us who you are and what your question is. If you do have comments, please say it's a comment meant to stimulate discussion. Depending on the number of hands that go up immediately, we may go a round of questions and then back to the panel, or we may go one by one. So the floor is open. No questions so far.
My name is Roland Roebuck, and I'm with the Afro-Latino Caucus, which is a group in Washington, D.C. that addresses issues of racism within the Hispanic community in D.C. My question is related to the attitude of Afro-Colombians with respect to the government providing services to Venezuelan refugees, but neglecting the massive level of displacement that exists, impacting the Afro-Colombians. That's question number one. Question number two, I'm interested in, historically and racially, what has been the relationship between Trinidad and Venezuela, and whether or not that particular dynamic has affected their level of reception of embracing a majority of white Venezuelans coming to Trinidad. And I end by saying that my son-in-law is Afro-Venezuelan, so I don't have any bias in this process.
launched us with some great questions. So, Melanie?
Sure. So we didn't go to some of the areas that were mostly where most Afro-Colombians were on this trip. I have in the past been to, say, Chocó and other areas. It was reported generally that there was concern amongst displaced Colombians. I was unable to disaggregate for Afro-Colombians and other displaced Colombians. I'm aware it's a particular issue with the Afro-Colombian community. I was told by a number of organizations that they were really worried that we were creating, as they put it, una guerra entre pobres, like a war between poor peoples here, and we're setting up one group against another group over very scarce resources. And so I think that the comments I was making about the concern about shifting of resources all to the Venezuelans without also putting resources into those very poor communities who have been displaced. We're talking 7.7 million still displaced, many of whom are from the poorest communities, such as the Afro-Colombian communities, who suffer a lot of discrimination. So I agree. I think one of the things we all have to be talking about when talking about Venezuelans in Colombia is to say, don't forget the internal crisis in Colombia at the same time, because it's going to hit not only the host population, but also those who are coming into the country. On Trinidad, the relationship between Trinidad and Venezuela. So they've had quite a close relationship with Venezuela. They're a very small country off the edge of Venezuela. And as I understand it, there were a number of issues of oil and gas deals. How does it affect the attitude about white Venezuelans coming in? I can't comment on that. What I can say is that throughout both Colombia and Trinidad, and I've also recently been to Ecuador and Peru, the issue of xenophobia, race or with regard to race or not with regard to race, with concerning Venezuelans coming in, has been of great concern and probably of greatest concern in Trinidad. And there, that may be a racial issue. I don't know. We were informed that I talked to a lot of Venezuelans and Cuban refugees and asylum seekers who talked with great distress about xenophobic radio programs that portrayed all Venezuelans as drug dealers and sex workers, and felt that this had an impact on their lives. And so that was a particular concern. I can't say how much specifically it was about race.
Jeff, did you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Roland. To get us started, let's take two questions here. The gentleman here, and then we'll take three. You, and then Andrew in the back. Yeah, you're first.
Okay. Hi, good morning. My name is Valentin. I'm a graduate student here at Georgetown. And my question is for you, Melanie. You mentioned, I found it really interesting that you mentioned the indigenous community and how they're facing difficulties. Could you elaborate and expand a little bit more on, like, perhaps specific unique difficulties that they encounter versus the average refugee? And a follow-up to that, if there's anything that's being organized for them to help them at this moment. Thank you.
Why don't we take your question? In the third row, you had your hand up? Yeah. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Rachel Baker. I go to LA School. Here I'm a graduate student, but I'm also interested in global public health, and I was wondering if you could speak maybe to the health conditions in Venezuela, but also the conditions that they're meeting when they migrate to these countries, and settling, or like what types of settlement there's been.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Andrew Seeley, President of Migration Policy Institute. I want to ask you about the border mobility cards. How much, there's a large number of people that have these border mobility cards, well over 2 million. I wonder how much mobility there is back and forth. This is an issue we haven't had a chance to look at yet. And you could tell, or are those mostly people that are getting those to get into Colombia and stay? You know, are they sort of becoming de facto resident permits, or are there really people going back and forth?
Terrific. Thank you. Let's go to our panel now. No?
Sure. On the indigenous, so we met with some members of the Wayu community in the Rio Hacha area and the Yukpa community in the Cucuta area. And I think that, first of all, we were hearing of big problems with getting documents. Often they're less likely to have had some of the documents that others would have. Some also because these are binational groups. And so they may have been living in Venezuela and they don't really recognize the border. So they might be registered under one name in Venezuela and another name in Colombia, and that creates huge problems for them because they just don't quite fit the system. And I think what struck me particularly was going to a kind of informal settlement of Yucpa near Cucuta, which was, I think, perhaps the most depressing thing of the trip that I saw, because they were living near a river that was rising. Their leader had just drowned because they weren't being allowed to cross the official bridge, and so they were crossing the river and it had risen. They were terrified of their neighbors, many of whom were threatening them, and there was a perception of them that they were there to sell contraband. They were going across the border there and back with contraband. And I think no understanding often that maybe they were bringing something for a ceremony, a particular indigenous ceremony they were having, then they didn't really see the border. And so I think there is a real need for a focus on on the situation of indigenous. In the case of the Yucpa, in fact, a case is being brought before the Inter-American Commission to try and ensure that they are recognized as a binational group and get specific attention. In their case, they needed a different place to live because it was too dangerous. But I think there are different indigenous groups in different areas who have particular problems, but land is often part of it, and documents. On health conditions, I don't have details about inside Venezuela, but what I was hearing in Colombia was there was a real concern that they were that diseases that they had wiped out previously were now coming back because of Venezuelans who have not been immunized, and then the other issue is you're getting people with chronic. So you've got the diseases, the diseases coming back, but you've also got a lot of people with chronic illnesses who were getting treated, people who were being treated for HIV, who were being treated for kidney problems and for cancer, who are now arriving without that in desperate search for some health care. In Colombia, the government gives emergency health care to anyone who arrives. The issue is what counts as an emergency, and that's been in the courts. For example, some local areas were saying that giving birth was not an emergency, and others were saying that it was. Now the courts have said that giving birth is an emergency which requires medical attention. So it depends where you are as to what's counted as an emergency. If you have the PEP, this up to 2-year residence and work permit, you have access to join the national health insurance system, but there are a lot of bureaucratic problems for people to be able to do that. And then, of course, there's the half of people who don't have those documents at all. To be fair to Trinidad and Tobago, the Venezuelans do actually have access to primary health care in Trinidad and Tobago, but there were often blocks because of language and because of discrimination, and because we heard of people being taken away by immigration officials from hospitals. Somebody having informed the immigration department, but in theory they have access. On the border cards, there's a lot of mobility back and forth, a lot. We were told the vast majority of people come in for the day and go back again for the day. So they're coming in to buy and sell, to work, to access community kitchens, even for the kids to go to school for the day and go back. So I think mostly they are used for that back and forth for the day, and it's just to facilitate daily life, because as you say, there didn't used to be any documents at all. People would just cross that border. And so it's good to see that they've reopened it. I don't think it's mostly being used for people coming to move on. That's not what we heard. And of course, you can, if you're picked up using the TMF, the border pass, to go further, you could be pushed back.
Just a few points on those. On the matter of response to indigenous migrants and refugees, I think when it comes to the Yucpa, I believe Colombia doesn't recognize the binational status of the Yucpa, which is part of the problem. That's different from their response to the YU, which they do recognize as having some kind of binational status. More generally, in Colombia as well as in Brazil, I think what we haven't seen is a more differentiated approach to the needs of indigenous Venezuelans who are fleeing. I think in Brazil, so me and my colleague Jimena actually traveled to the Colombian and Brazilian borders in the middle of last year and produced a report that is woefully out of date now that Melanie has produced this incredible update. And one thing that we saw there was that the response to, so Brazil's response has been much more focused on creating essentially refugee camps, both directly on the border and in the largest border town, Boa Vista. But there has been much less progress in what they call the interiorization process. So basically providing some kind of incentives and opportunities for these people who are clustered on the Venezuelan border to seek economic opportunities elsewhere in Brazil. In the Warao in particular in Brazil complain that Brazilian authorities do not recognize their own traditional leadership and are not taking into account their distinct needs. As far as the health conditions in Venezuela, the Pan American Health Organization, working with the Global Fund for HIV, malaria and tuberculosis, I'm not sure if it's in that order, but the PAHO actually worked with the Global Fund to produce some kind of emergency plan to respond to the urgent health needs in Venezuela. That document is now public, and it's worth studying because while official data in Venezuela is, if it's collected at all, it's not public. But there are some alarming data points in there. One of them is the fact that the Venezuelan Health Ministry itself is recognizing that on these three issues, on HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, there's a need for $30 million alone that they currently can't meet because of a lack of resources in the country. Third, on the border mobility cards, my understanding is that they're not valid as a valid form of ID outside of border departments in Colombia. So the idea that they create some kind of way for Venezuelans to seek entry into Colombia and stay, they don't offer much security, because if you're picked up by Colombian authorities and you present a border mobility card and you're in Bogota, you're going to be deported.
Thank you. Further questions? Okay, we have 3 in this group. Why don't you go this 1, 2, and then 3.
Hi, I'm Michaela Rear. I'm a grad student at Georgetown and an intern at RI right now. I'm just curious if you could comment to what extent you saw any disparities between rural and urban experiences for, I guess, both the Venezuelans and IDPs in Colombia.
Great.
Marilyn Shapley with my State Policy Advisor. I was hoping to hear a little bit more, primarily from Jeff, but also Melanie, if you have thoughts on political willingness to resource and support the regional humanitarian response moving forward. It sounded like you had some resourcing concerns, but curious if you see the Quito process continuing to be a place to engage and support, and then also country by country, if you've been hearing any expectations about how quickly Venezuelans would be expected to want to go home, definitely obviously being the preference there. So just kind of curious if you've been hearing forecasting along those lines.
Thanks. And one further question.
Hi, Magdalena Nivia from the Howard G. Bucket Foundation. Just have 2 questions for you. I was wondering if you could comment on John Bolton's diagnosing groups, note any concerns of U.S. military intervention or the potential for U.S. military intervention in the region. And then my second question is if you have any recommendations for donors on how to support the crisis beyond just emergency assistance, or if you do believe that most of donor support should be focused on emergency assistance. Thank you.
Wow, another set of great questions.
I'll look at the first and the last question, I think. And the first, I don't have too much to say on the rural-urban issue. A lot of the people arriving, the Venezuelans were coming from cities, but and I think it depends on geography as well, where people come to. So from Trinidad and Tobago, you were getting people from a particular part of Venezuela who were 7 miles away from that area, some of whom were rural, but many of whom were urban. Into Colombia, you're getting more of a mix, I suppose. What we did see was was on the Colombian IDP situation. A lot of the conflicts are happening in rural areas, and then the people are moving to the cities, and a real problem for them to adapt to being in a city. So that was more the IDP scenario where we saw the rural-urban divide. But I don't have enough information, I'm afraid, on that. On the recommendations for donors on beyond emergency, I absolutely think it's very important that a lot of the focus is beyond emergency. There's a need for initial arrival for people to get some assistance, and it's helpful seeing the community kitchen set up and the 3 month of vouchers that the World Food Programme is providing to many people. But most people are then heading to a city, and what they need help with is ways to get a job, it's ways to ensure that their children are in school, and that there's healthcare. And it's those longer-term integration measures that are much more, that need a lot of the funding.
Yeah, on the rural and urban divide, it's what you would expect in areas where there's very little state presence. So I was actually in Guajira 2 weeks ago, very in the far north of the Venezuela-Colombia border, and the number of Venezuelans there is astounding. And there's much less state presence there. And so in areas where there is less state presence, obviously the situation faced by Venezuelans is much more dire. On political reactions to the crisis regionally, I think we'll have to wait for Quito 3 to really see how this shakes out. But I don't know. Maybe Melanie is more optimistic. So far what we've seen is there's a ton of lip service to the need for some kind of coordinated response, and very little in the way of more concrete commitments, but also a ton of interest in funding. So I think that that creates challenges, but also opportunities. That ties to the last question about emergency funding. I think governments in the region have so far shown immense interest in receiving cash on this, and they're very interested in talking about the need for more funding for emergency responses. I think that is a useful point of leverage to trying to encourage a more long-term strategy. The second thing I would say is that it's essential that donors not only focus on some emergency funding, but also on the long-term advocacy needs for Venezuelans. I mean, this is even if the government topples tomorrow and there is a democratic transition in Venezuela, the country is in such a deep economic hole that there's likely to be continued human suffering in the country for the next few years as a result of the current situation. So I don't think that there will be a quick fix to this. On a military intervention on the 5,000 troops, our understanding is there's no appetite for military intervention in this administration, and that's a very good thing, because military intervention in Venezuela would be a logistical nightmare. There's at least 500,000 Venezuela militia members in the country that have some kind of command structure and access to weapons outside of the traditional armed forces. If just a tenth of those were to, let's say, go to the mountains in the event of a U.S. invasion, that's a force that is twice as large as the FARC ever were in Colombia. So I think we need to be very clear that external military intervention in Venezuela would be a complete disaster, and it should be avoided at all costs. As far as that, the yellow notepad, I think there's likely some kind of chess happening here. There's a lot of signaling. I think there's an attitude that maximum pressure is what's needed right now, and again, our concern is that the Venezuelan people are suffering, and the longer that the current state of affairs continues, the more need there is for some kind of meaningful negotiated process that leads to new elections. And I think that that is very clearly the way forward.
Great. I want to thank everybody, and I want to also give our panelists an opportunity for final reflections. And I have one question of my own for Melanie in that respect, in terms of your reports are very new. But I wonder if you have a sense already of how receptive governments, in this case we're talking two governments, are to your findings and to your recommendations, as a sense of what need they feel to help strengthen their own responses.
Thank you. I think that with regard to Colombia, one of the things that the government there is obviously, as you say, very keen to have assistance. It's good to see that the World Bank, there's recently been an agreement on concessional loans for Colombia, similar to how there was been in Jordan and Lebanon for countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees. And I'm hopeful that the Colombian government does seem to want to do further, to have further registration and regularization processes. So I'm hoping that on that, the Colombian government may learn the lessons of things that went well and went badly with the last round of that. With Trinidad and Tobago, there's been a lot. I'm pleased to see that there's been a lot in the Trinidadian media about the report that we did this last week, and we're told that there is potential for discussion in the Trinidadian Parliament about this issue, and that the opposition is taking up the concerns about this issue. So it seems like it might be a moment for possible movement.
Jeff, concluding thoughts?
I have no deep thoughts to offer at this time, other than to really thank Melanie for her incredible job on this, and congratulate Refugees International for two really important reports. And I know that we're both going to be following this issue moving forward in the coming months, and I look forward to working with you all and others on the regional response.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, our audience, those who are watching on the live stream, and just a reflection of my own, thinking about all the issues that have been surfaced here today, how complicated it is, but thinking about often hearing expressions of solidarity from people throughout Latin America about the role that Venezuela as a country and a government has played in their own desperate times in their own countries, in terms of fleeing dictatorships, in terms of fleeing internal armed conflicts, in terms of fleeing their own wars, and helping to resolve those crises as well. And I think as severe as the challenges are today, I think supporting that sense of solidarity for a strong and humane regional response with support from external actors, of course, is so crucial. And the debt that many, many, many thousands, if not millions of people in Latin America feel to the role that Venezuela has played in their lives, I think is crucial to keep in mind. So with that, I want to thank you all again, thank our panelists, thank Refugees International for their work here, and we will, of course, be following this closely. Thanks again. Bye.